Welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
Also, for me, Hunchprose operates at several levels. On the one hand, it's a question of what is the place of poetry today? So Hunchprose, which I'm about to read, really is a somewhat playful take on this. So alongside all of the other questions, it's also a question of where does my voice stand? What does the solitary, short lyric have to say to a complex world, and how can it expand itself and break itself open?
You just heard a tiny nugget by Ranjit Hoskote from What's to Come this episode. Ranjit Hoskote is a poet, cultural theorist, and curator. He is in conversation with journalist Supriya Nair from Mumbai. She is the editor of the publication 52 and co-founder of the media company All Things Small. The elemental relevance of poetry in lives and times such as ours is what binds this conversation with poet Ranjit Hoskote and journalist Supriya Nair together. Ranjit's newest collection of poetry, Hunchprose, is a response to and the reflection of the many lives the poet possesses within him. This conversation delves deep into inspirations, memories, mythologies, and other literatures, stories, and experiences that affords us a glimpse into the life of the polymath and how life traces verse and vice versa. Over to you, Supriya.
Thank you, Lekha. And thank you, Ranjit. It's an honor and a pleasure, as always, to be in conversation with you.
It's marvelous to be here. I want to thank Ravi and Lekha and the Bangalore International Centre. And Supriya, I want to thank you for doing this. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And I look forward very much to our session today.
As do I. Congratulations on publishing a triumph of a poetry collection.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Can you describe the circumstances that led to the writing of Hunchprose?
Sure. Hunchprose really began for me in the aftermath of my previous book, Jonahwhale, which took on as its canvas the histories of the sea and how we make our way through an increasingly difficult, catastrophe-ridden world. But my persona, if you will, in Jonahwhale was the solitary navigator whose destinies are yet connected to other people, other species, other historical situations. So that figure was Nemo, he was Ahab, he was Jonah, he was Odysseus. What happened to me after that as a poet was feeling that maybe I should pull back to a more episodic way of thinking about these problems, about feeling my way into this world where we were troubled by those who would silence us, troubled by unknown forces that had a butterfly effect across the globe. And I was really haunted and continue to be haunted by the havoc we're unleashing on the natural world. So these were the sensations and the thoughts and the anxieties that really went into Hunchprose.
I like the word you used, troubled, which does seem to suit Hunchprose much better than it does Jonahwhale, even though the two collections have commonalities, of course, which I hope we can talk about later. Jonahwhale is stormy to me, but Hunchprose is troubled and troubling. I wondered if you would read the titular poem.
Sure. Also, for me, Hunchprose operates at several levels. On the one hand, it's a question of what is the place of poetry today? So Hunchprose, which I'm about to read, really is a somewhat playful take on this. And I'm going to read it and then maybe talk about it. So alongside all of the other questions, it's also a question of where does my voice stand? What does the solitary, short lyric have to say to a complex world, and how can it expand itself and break itself open? These were some of the if you will, formal questions for me. So this is the title poem, Hunchprose, and it goes like this. He calls me Hunchprose, but what's a word between murderous rivals? Across from me he strops his fine blade, smooth talker, barefaced liar, his fart, teller of tall tales who wraps you up in his flying carpet, serves you snake oil, carries off the princess every time. And I, what can I offer you except fraying knots, coiled riddles, scrolled bones, keys to doors that were carted away by raiders, betrayed by splayed light and early snow, lost doors I could have opened with my breath. Call me Hunchprose. I bend over my ink drift words, and when I spring back up, I sting.
Thank you. That made me think of Ariel, among others.
Yes.
and the scrolled bones.
Which are in the air.
Of which perhaps some choral can be made, Ranjit.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. For me, Hunchprose is really an embodiment of poetry, which is often seen to be a marginal, sometimes elitist activity, but which remains at the root of all our articulation. It's the deep source. And I think as poets today, we're in a strange position where we can claim this ancestry that goes back to the shamans and the griots and the oracles. And on the other hand, in the ambit of print and digital modernity, there's the question of where does poetry figure? And it's interesting that in this year of the pandemic, poetry has really become important to many, many people, I notice, which is in some sense a reassurance and a vindication. But in the context of this poem, it's really poetry setting itself up against the buzz of data, the news cycles, the claims of prose. And at the back of my mind was also the figure of Quasimodo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, this deformed figure who yet produces the most enchanting and memorable music.
Yes. You know, the Paris Review just asked Robert Haas last year.
You're right.
How does a poem occur to you? So I feel in all humility, I can put that question to you too. Where do your poems come from?
That is a mystery, I think, even to poets, because poems announce themselves in different ways. Sometimes it's a stray phrase, sometimes it's an image that pretty much falls from the sky. Sometimes it's something you mishear in conversation. You overhear, you mishear, and then there's that line that suddenly comes up and makes great sense. But often for me, it's also a part of a practice where I keep these fragments and notes that go back many, many years, and I revisit them. And poems often get sparked off from two fragments that have not much to do with each other. And in bridging them, a poem gets produced. But poems for me are also ways of responding to some of these larger anxieties that I talked about a little earlier. It's also a way of bearing witness to the sheer precariousness of me as an individual, but what I share with large numbers of people today on the planet. So I think the poem becomes a bridge between your solitary problems and questions and those that other people have. It's really a form of reaching out.
I want to come back to this idea because I'm fascinated by how you employ words and rhythm in service of an idea, but also where the idea serves the words, the rhythms, the languages, the music. And I'm fascinated by how you enact this balance.
Supriya, for me, actually, it's often the music that comes first, and the idea is something that gets woven in the course of the poem. And that finds its way to some form of conclusion or some open end, if you will. And thinking back, I think it was music that really came first. to me, even as a child. I grew up listening to a lot of music at home because my parents had this garage turntable, which we still have. And I grew up listening to the very eclectic choice of music that they had. It could be Ali Akbar Khan Saab on the sarod and Ravi Shankar on the sitar one day. It could be Emilio Pericoli another day. It could be Shostakovich. All of this was what surrounded me. So I very early began to respond to the magic of cadence, of beat, of how you could make patterns in time. And that for me is a key driver for my poetry as well. So this musicality that I prize, and increasingly I've been, instead of leading different lives as a listener and as a poet, I've actually tried to bring these together. So also the music that I deeply respond to, Steve Reich, Terry Riley, all of that has come into these more recent poems in terms of tempo, in terms of cadence, in terms of what happens between word and pause on the page.
Did you study music yourself when you were growing up?
No, I wish I had. I just listened voraciously, if one can listen voraciously, yeah.
What were some of the subjects of your earliest poems?
The earliest poems, literally chronologically, I would date back to my last year at school and moving outward from there. I think those were early explorations of, I have to say, of nature, and I don't want to say this with a capital N, but I'd had this childhood where I shuttled from a rather sylvan early childhood in Goa, really surrounded by greenery on all hands, to Bombay, which was a bit of an urban shock to me. I was born in Bombay, but we moved and then we came back. So this shuttling between the natural world and what it means to be solitary yet connected to nature, and the peculiar forms of anonymity, belonging, and alienation in the city, that was to me a key driver even at that early point. So there was that. And there was always this fascination with deep scales of time. So whether that was history or closer engagement with geological cycles or with astronomy. I used to be an amateur astronomer. So I was always fascinated by this sense of being a self adrift among these different scales of time. So I've carried those impulses with me from relatively more stylized apprentice work of early on to wherever it's got to now.
And another interest of yours has been maps and cartography, hasn't it?
Very much so, yeah. I've always been fascinated by voyages, by journeys. I've never been impressed by borders or territorial conceptions of belonging. So cartography was very early an interest. And I've also been interested in systems of cartography across the world, because I think for most of us, and this is the way the world has gone after the colonial encounter, we tend to be shaped by European and North American forms of map making. In the last 15 or 20 years, it's been a liberation to look at maps that were produced elsewhere, or the maps that were made here by the Mughals, by the Bahmanis, by the Marathas. It's literally a different way of picturing and negotiating the world. And also when you take up a maritime position on the world and society, it's hugely liberating, because suddenly you see countries and continents as spaces of confinement. And whilst I don't want to romanticize the sea, it certainly offers these possibilities of inventing or learning new languages, of encountering the dissimilar. That's been a vital concern of mine across the poetry, and also a book like Confluences, which I wrote with Ilya Troyanov.
Yes, and intensifies in different ways in Jonahwhale and in Hunchprose.
Yes, indeed.
So I'd like to talk about the emotional textures of some of the poems in Hunchprose, particularly sort of there's a middle stretch of very intense, shorter poems. I wondered if you could either voice or town.
Sure. Let me try town.
Yes.
Town. In this town, ask for directions in whispers. Tell no one your birth name. Say you're on your way to nightfall. Buy more bread than you'll eat. Read the signboards forwards and back. Mimic the rare songbird hiding in a bush. Stride along the pipeline bridging the creek. Shuffle off the linen strap on the Kevlar. Play infidel on the hill, believer on the beach, because one blue is so much closer to us than the other. On your knees in the sand, and when it's time, pray you'll come back as pearl thread surf, not driftwood, in this town.
Thank you. I felt like I immediately understood the circumstance of this poem. Though if you asked me to describe it back to you, I would be unable to. It just feels like a poem that anyone who's lived in Bombay has lived.
Yes, I think it does speak to that experience of what's happened in Bombay, especially from the early 1990s onwards. I have vivid and still terrifying memories of the riots, the pogroms that took place under cover of the riots, the flames and the smoke rising from burning timber warehouses, the silent trains. It's all very, very vividly present to me. But today it could be every town in India. And just the sense of how very divided we've become and how vulnerable and insecure many, many of us are today. And I think that's the experience that this poem tries to speak to.
I mean, there's disquiet there, there's precarity, and longing, though I think maybe not in a simple way. How do you contain the sharpness and intensity of the emotion that goes into poems like these? What is the practice of that?
Again, I would probably reach out to a metaphor from music. It's the way in which all of the affect, the emotional currents of what you're saying find shape in the way in which it's all composed. So, for instance, in a Hindustani classical exposition, you would have all of that emotional richness and uncertainty that comes, say, from the bandish, from the song text. But it's put in place, it's shaped, it's released at different kinds of forms of momentum. And that's really what I've been working with. I think that's been a sort of experimental proposition for me in many of these poems.
Maybe we can come back to that.
Now, in Town, for instance, it's a kind of circularity because it begins and ends with the same words, in this town. But the journey you've made, or we've made together, as I read and you listen, is you realize that you haven't come back to the same town.
Yes,
yeah.
indeed.
Yeah.
And as you were reading, I was thinking of the coastal road that's coming up now, covering a large part of the sea that bore witness to some of your worst memories.
Absolutely.
And that landscape is changing too.
Yeah, and the seascapes that we had, the vista out from Marine Drive, the absolutely memorable view of Haji Ali. It is such a redemption as you go past it to look out to this island. And it's no longer visible, and it's certainly going to be constrained by the coastal road and all of its rather ugly architecture. You
have a beautiful poem entitled Haji Ali in this collection too.
Yes, I do.
Ranjit, oh dear, our engineer is going to have to do a lot of editing over here as we giggle over each other. Ranjit, how does it feel to be known as a Bombay poet?
I have very ambivalent feelings about that. At least partly because for a generation that may not have known the older Bombay poets, this term has come to have a great freight of nostalgia. So people tend to think of Nissim Ezekiel, Dom Moraes, Adil Jassawala, Eunice D'Souza, and they were a very important phalanx, and they were very important figures, certainly to my generation. But I'd like to open up that definition of the Bombay poets. I think our Anglophone subculture of here in Bombay was always open to poets who came through from elsewhere, from Delhi, from Allahabad, from overseas. And I don't know that we were all shaped in the same way by the city of Bombay. Because Bombay itself is porous, osmotic, kaleidoscopic. So I'm personally not in favor of seeing it as a closed school or movement. And just for me, I don't really see myself as a city poet, because along with Bombay poet goes that other notion of how people who live in metropolitan centers must be city poets, right? Because that's where they live. I've always, if anything, I've really seen myself much more as a poet preoccupied with nature and with history and with displacement and mobility. So the city is a place I start from and return to, but those arcs of journeying out and back are, to me, almost more important than being defined by the city.
Right. In the sense, you are a typical denizen of the city, but perhaps not a typical poet, or perhaps not what someone would typically associate with the phrase Bombay poet.
Absolutely. But also, as I've been thinking about your question, Supriya, it occurs to me that maybe I do draw on Bombay's linguistic history more than seems evident. Because normally when you say Bombay poet, it's assumed that it's a kind of defensive Anglophone position. But I would draw on the city's multilingual histories. And that's been very important to me from really early on. When I was at Elphinstone College, for instance, although I studied the social sciences, I spent a fair amount of time with the faculty in the Marathi and the Gujarati departments, who were all major writers, actually. And there was an openness. There were multilingual readings that took place in college, also at the PN All India Center, with which I was associated from my late teens. So this awareness of being nourished by multiple languages has been very, very strong for me. And I think increasingly it's playing more and more of a role in the poems I read.
Yes, I think it reflects in the poems in Hunchprose, in some more obviously than others. It reflects in your career as a translator, Ranjit.
Yes, it does, actually. I mean, translation began for me precisely out of this kind of cradle and crucible of my late teens and early 20s, both this ethos at Elphinstone College and also the near and inspiring presence of people like Aga Shahid Ali, Dilip Chitre, Arun Kolatkar, A.K. Ramanujan. I mean, these are people who were flesh and blood reality to my generation, and certainly to me. So today one tends to see them through a kind of optic of nostalgia, but I remember them as they were, wonderfully generous with their time, their thoughts, their insights, and their practice was exemplary to me, of straddling languages, of translating. Yeah, so that's where I began. So the 20 years of working on Lal Ded, and also in more recent times, the translations I've been doing of Ghalib and of Mir Mir.
Yes, which you post on Twitter.
Yes, that was my so-called Mir project, where I would put up a share, the original, the translation, and an image drawn from Mughal, Safavid, or Rajput, or Bahmani paintings. I keep saying Bahmani paintings, Deccani paintings, to be absolutely accurate.
Right. A completely delightful project.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to come back to some of the continuities between Hunchprose and your last collection, Jonahwhale, which, as you know, I love and admire, and I've had a longer acquaintance with, so I feel a bit closer to as of now, though that will change perhaps.
Thank you.
I'm really struck by how elemental and how close to the natural world both these books are. And the common elements are, I suppose there's a lay reader of poetry for whom the natural world is contained in fruits or flowers or trees. Can you talk a little bit about the geography of both these poems?
Supriya, for me, thinking about nature or feeling my way into nature has really sprung from two seemingly different kinds of contexts. One is the immediate, visceral childhood experience of nature, which is just so integrally a part of me, and this immense sense of being at large in this expanded world under the open sky. And that's a sensation of freedom that I've carried with me from my remote Goan childhood, growing up in a house on a hill. I've carried that with me all my life. But I've also, over these years of reflecting on what it means to write about nature, realized that, like everything else, nature poetry is constructed within an ideological framework. And you know this, of course. The fact is that this romantic turn towards nature is really a response to the Industrial Revolution. So the romantics who unfortunately are taught at school as these sort of simple-minded, dreamy figures floating around a landscape were actually trying to retrieve what they could of this expansive, visceral sense of connection with nature at a time when it was being overridden and overruled by the protocols of industry, by railways, by factories, by large-scale infrastructure activities, which is a reality to us here in India when I think about what's happening to our ecology, the way our forests, our wetlands, our marshes are all being overridden and destroyed. That devastation unleashed in the 18th century is clear and present to us today. So what does it mean to write about nature in awareness of this? It's in awareness that what you're writing about is fragile, vulnerable, and vanishing even as you're writing. So this, to me, is an ever-present commitment. So when I think about geographies, or when I think about ecologies, it's a sense of endings, of extinctions, of migrant populations of animals. These are the things that preoccupy me. And I've always also been fascinated by the possibility of communicating across species. So in some of these poems in Hunchprose, for instance, you'll find that there's an attempt to reach out with a measure of empathy to for instance, this very young fox, that Arctic fox that made an incredible journey from Norway to Canada across the ice. So these are some of the commitments that I have also as a citizen of an endangered planet and as a member of a species that has endangered the planet in this way. We're the only species that destroys its own habitat.
Yes. And the stamp of that destruction and how it affects us is so clear in so many of your poems. I want to turn to a broader subject. I want to talk about the act of poetic deliberation. Because you, Ranjit, are a thinking poet, are a poet of all poets are thinking poets. But you might be described as a practitioner of poetic deliberation in an age of poetic spontaneity. I think you'll know what I'm talking about because
I think I do.
Because we talked about this a little while ago, and I brought up the fact that a vast number of young people now read and create poetry on social media.
Right.
What's it like seeing this change?
To be quite honest, I've always been a votary of a diverse poetry scene. So, for instance, about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer, there was what seemed to me to be a false binary between so-called page poetry and so-called stage poetry. This is when spoken word was becoming very prominent. Now, that's all very entertaining from the point of view of trying to brand a new choice of platform or delivery, if you will. But the fact is that poetry has always been stage poetry. Print is relatively recent, whilst performance has been with us from the oral tradition, from the deep source of where poetic utterance comes from. So I think that's a non-binary in the first place. And I've always been committed to dialogue among the different kinds of poetic choices and poetic practices. Again, I would welcome social media actually as a platform that allows for certain kinds of literary articulations. I mean, my own very belated discovery of Instagram, for instance, I've realized that you can actually craft these posts in a certain way that makes them meaningful to you as an author, and hopefully will have some resonance and meaning to your intended readers. But I completely understand what you're saying, where the idea that spontaneity means simply putting out whatever is uppermost in your mind at this time, your anguish, your sense of hurt, your grievance. It seems to me that that might take the poem so far, but not further. I warm to a notion of poetry where I can come to something that was written 100, 500, 1,000 years ago, and it still releases itself to me in unpredictable ways. I think there's a certain inexhaustibility to the work of art, whether that's a poem, a painting, or an installation. And that is a value to be cherished. So sometimes you can have a throwaway, self-destruct kind of poem, and that has its place. But I don't know that beyond a point, that helps us to build these bridges of empathy. Because why else are we communicating except to build some kind of bridge and invite your listeners to cross it?
Yes. I think there's the sense that social media, or perhaps the practice of poetry on, Instagram or YouTube, makes poetry seem easy. And I am frankly delighted by that notion, because someone whose education or upbringing hasn't encouraged them to enjoy poetry finds easy access to it as a listener, as a reader, and then perhaps as someone who's encouraged to write. But having taken that leap, it would be nice for the notion to be seeded that poetry can also be used to say what is difficult.
Absolutely. And increasingly, there are many difficult things that need to be said and that people in authority do not want us to say. So poetic utterance is both fragile and vulnerable, and yet incredibly important today. And at the same time, I think I hesitate to offer advice, especially to the young, because the young are programmed to resist advice. And having a very long time ago been young, I recognize that, acknowledge that very clearly. So, but what I'd say is, honestly, you can't really write poetry without having read it and having been immersed in a culture of poetry. I think that's vital, in a culture of reading poetry or listening to poetry. And I sometimes think that that's what's missing in a number of poets who go out there and want to say their piece. But you might want to read and see if someone said your piece already elsewhere long ago. Maybe there's something to learn from generations that have gone before. Maybe there's a critical engagement to be had with them. I think these are all the necessary forms, reflexes, and practices that you really need as you prepare for a life in poetry.
That was very generous and very sharply and usefully critical as well. So thank you on behalf of many listeners, Ranjit, for saying that.
Thank you, Supriya.
Speaking of the political environment, how did that affect you while you were composing Hunchprose?
It was oppressively present. And I don't know how it can be otherwise for any of us. The sense that your worldview, your values, your commitment to diversity, to openness, to dialogue, all of this was under a ruthless and relentless attack. And Hunchprose was definitely written with this not only very much in mind, but very much fully as a bodied experience, a sense that you were being constrained. An awareness that you, meaning people like you and me, were relatively privileged and protected. It was very, very clear that many of our compatriots were at immense risk just because they were who they were in terms of their, let's say, their ethnic or their gender or their religious or their linguistic identities. Also that we were all being pushed into boxes not of our own making. And that kind of politics is something I utterly abhor, where people tell you who you are and what you can do or not do. So the sense of pushing up against all of that is very, very strong in Hunchprose to me. It may or may not be manifest in the poems, but it certainly informs them.
I think that sense of urgency that other readers have remarked on as well, that we see in Hunchprose, that is in continuity with some of your earlier poetry, but is really also more fully evident and more newly evident, I think, in Hunchprose than in any of the previous work. I think that does convey some of the jaggedness and the intensity of what we are living through.
Right.
Let me ask you then about the pandemic and the fact that we've all been cooped up in our homes for a year.
Right.
How does a poet get his poems across when we're all boxed in?
Actually, the pandemic has opened up new possibilities for communication, for collaboration, and for sharing common ground and creating common ground, I think. At first, the first months were, of course, months of uncertainty and anxiety. Also with aging parents and relatives, we were very, very worried about the kinds of new forms of isolation that necessarily then had to be imposed. So there was all of that. But pretty early on, I decided that I was going to treat this as a long-term residency and to sit down and continue with what I could do and what I was equipped to do in that sense. So it actually allowed for a deeper commitment to my everyday practices of writing and reading and listening to music, and yet also refining this sense of a 360-degree political awareness, because the pandemic has also been a great opportunity for those who would constrain and curtail our freedoms. So all of this was going on at the same time. And much as we might complain about Zoom, for instance, which brings us together in this conversation today, it was also very heartening to see how poets, writers, cultural producers of other kinds embraced this new technology. We all stumbled and were hesitant and not very good at it early on. But honestly, it's really opened up new forms of dialogue. Also in very simple practical terms, as for instance, at Pen at Prithvi, which is this literary platform that I've long been associated with. Going online allowed us to bring in people from other cities, other countries, subject only to questions of time zone and availability. We've really been able to expand the community.
This is heartening to hear, and I suspect will make many listeners look back on the year that they have had in a slightly kinder light.
Yes, indeed.
I think we should try an experiment, Ranjit. For those who haven't seen the poems on the page yet, I wonder if we can try on this podcast to give them a sense of the shape of one of your poems and demonstrate how musicality and how visuality come into the experience of these poems. Shall we try that?
I would be very happy to do that. Do you have a poem in mind that you'd like me to?
Well, voice was very striking to me, but if there's another one you would prefer.
No, let's go with voice. Happy to do that.
Okay, let's do that.
And it actually is incredible because some of the lines came to me when I was listening to a concert by Samarth Nagarkar, who was a marvelous vocalist. So it really has this kind of deep connection to music in some way. So, voice. I'd snatched at every straw and thought you'd got it right at last, swallowing swords when you could so easily have been sewing buttons. I should have told myself, be careful what you wish for, before you stropped yourself into a voice that could call down rain, rap out commandments, needle the air with prophecies, or draw it into a bowstring, snatch breath away. Why did you call down this darkness on yourself? Where in this garden of unsealed tombs did we lose our serenades?
Thank you so much. There's a lyrical quality to this poem that I think will instantly strike the listener. And I was reading along with you, and I was also noting how this was formatted on the page. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because it may again be possible for an unfamiliar reader to just think of this as lines of, kind of left justified text, divided into every 6 lines or 8 lines or so, which is not what is going on.
Yeah, I've actually gone back to something I was very, very interested in at a much earlier stage in my journey as a poet, which is mise en page, the moving around of text on a page, not for arbitrary reasons or because you want to set up some kind of decorative pattern, but precisely to see how one could work with breath units, with pauses. So the white space on the page becomes an equivalent of a pause, and how you time that pause and how you allow for different registers and tonalities of voice to come into play. Because what print does is to, in some sense, flatten the utterance or articulation. And how might we break that open? How might we make the poem a space where different voices or registers collide and coalesce? And for me, this also got a bit of traction when was it? 15 years ago. So I was working on the libretto of an opera. I was working with the absolutely incredible musician Vanraj Bhatia on libretto based on Girish Karnad's Agni Varsha, Girish's play, which Vanraj wanted to turn into an opera, and he invited me to write the libretto. I mean, I did some work on it and I had to move on for other reasons. And Rani Debora took it to its triumphal conclusion. But it was a marvelous apprenticeship for me. It also allowed me to think of the poem as a score, to think about how the poem is a sort of basis for improvisation. So these are the kinds of experiments invisible to the reader looking at print, which have gone into a poem like the one I just read, Voice.
I'm now going to ask you, as a finale, about the arcs of history that we can glimpse in Hunchprose. And I was particularly struck by how you opened and closed the collection, because you take us back in time as soon as the book opens with the voice of Sidi Mubarak Bombay,
Yeah.
about whom perhaps you can tell our listeners. And then after we've gone on this journey with you, not that I'm suggesting that Hunchprose be read linearly or in one sitting or anything else that's not preferable to the reader. But after the journey that we've been on through Hunchprose, you leave us in the depths of time, somewhere much, much further back than we've begun. Could you perhaps tell our listeners a little bit about that and about the choices that you made and why?
Supriya, like you, I have this sense that a book of poems could be read in a linear manner, as often books of poetry are meant to be. But I'm also aware that readers are just going to dip in at will and fasten on a poem that immediately attracts them, or to find their own patterns through the book. But Hunchprose and Jonahwhale before it, and Central Time before it, were all really designed to be a certain kind of chain or garland of poems. So there's a certain shifting valency, there's a movement of themes and so on that continues through the book. But thank you for pointing out how the book opens and closes with the presence of the sea, with vulnerability and danger on the coast, and with figures who really embody that. So Sidi Mubarak Bombay, in whose multilingually informed voice the book opens, was an enslaved person. He was brought from East Africa to Bombay in the mid-19th century. And I have him here because I've been fascinated by him for the longest time. He also reminds us that the slave trade was not confined to the Atlantic. You know, when we think about slavery, we tend to think about the Caribbean, the plantations in the south of the USA. And it's really the Atlantic that we believe is safely far away and of no immediate consequence to us, other than through ethical releasement to one of the most vicious phenomena in human history. But the fact is that we here on the West Coast were equally caught up in it. There were multiple slave trades going on in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, and they continued right up to the 19th century. So it was not long ago and far away. So in a way, it's also disclosing and claiming and bearing witness to another of Bombay's histories. We know Bombay as a city of cotton. We know it as a city of opium. We came to acknowledge and accept that. We have not yet begun to recognize it also as a node in the Eastern slave trade. So Sindhi Mubarak Bombay is to me a heroic figure, a survivor, someone who works in and through languages, who eventually liberates himself from his predicament, goes back. But as I say in the first line of the poem, which is the first line of the book, I should go home now, but I forget where that is. That's Sindhi Mubarak Bombay's predicament. And at the end, the last poem is Letters from Ugarit, which is a reenactment, if you will, of a historic tragedy of the destruction of a city which is in what is today northern Syria. It's a journey into deep time, but its themes, its questions, the way it unsettles us, that event, it's absolutely contemporary. What does it mean to save language against the random violence of history? What does it mean to ask for help that never arrives? What does it mean to be trapped by the forces of destruction? What does it mean to try and voice these situations in the hope that someone may hear them in decades and centuries to come? I think that to me is increasingly a compelling question as a response to the kind of time we live in.
I agree. And this poem made me think about history and our place in it and the work that we do in spite of everything. It made me look at it anew. And on that note, I will leave our listeners to discover more of Hunchprose and to read the poems and perhaps to be able to come out and when they're able to come out and hear you read them, to do so in better times. Ranjit, thank you very much for this conversation. It's been great fun.
Thank you so much, Supriya. I've really enjoyed this, and thank you for the attention that you've brought to Hunchprose and to my earlier work. I really, really appreciate that. It's the finest gift.
You always make me feel like a better reader, Ranjit, and I can't thank you enough for that.
It's just marvelous. It's as I was saying, it's the finest gift that a writer can expect to receive from a fellow writer. So thank you very much, Supriya.
Thank you, and thank you to the Bangalore International Centre and to Lekha.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.